5 years ago, I began a series of programs on the brain and aging. It seems fitting that, this year, my grandfather turns 95. And in his 95th year, he's as sharp as he's ever been. I began thinking about this in terms of myself and my own aging. I may be young right now, but how do I stay as fit and active and alert and aware as he's become? Specifically, how do you not lose your mind as you age? That's what I want to know.
You know, the fundamental of the idea that the adult brain is set in stone is, the common saying that you can't teach an old dog new tricks, but in fact you can. The adult brain, again, the ripe old age in their 40s, 50s, 60s, even beyond, can change its structure and function in a significant way.
Everyone I know who's getting older forgets things, makes jokes about having senior moments, but I think deep down inside, everyone is kind of concerned that they're headed down this path of losing their cognitive abilities. I think it's very clear that everyone doesn't lose their cognitive abilities.
It's good to see you.
It seems that really what happens is you're born with some number of neurons, and then you make more and more and more and more until you're at least a year old, maybe a little older. And then after that, your brain starts pruning off, maybe not killing off neurons, but killing off little branches of them that go off to form connections with other branches. Those connections are called synapses. And then somewhere in there you stop losing and you just have sort of a static number of neurons. But nobody has quite figured out, there's new evidence that shows that you do make some more, but nobody quite knows what the trigger is to make more neurons. Nobody knows how it happens. I think it's a hot topic, to say the least, in neuroscience, because if you could figure that out, you might have the solution to a lot of diseases and possibly to some mental capacities, that we wish we had.
Neurogenesis simply means the production of new neurons in the brain. We know that that process continues into at least early toddlerhood, but it had been thought that it stopped again around the age of 2 or 3. And the reason was it wasn't based on empirical observation, it was more just sort of backward reasoning. Namely, the brain is a very complicated computer, and surely if you just sort of haphazardly throw new wires into there, that can't do any good. Therefore, the brain cannot be making new wires, new neurons. Well, it turns out that in an experiment done in the late 90s, which was very clever, they took cancer patients who were terminal and who had, of course, given their consent to the experiment, and they labeled their brain neurons with a particular dye that was incorporated only in dividing cells, in other words, only in cells that were making more of themselves. And this is something that, of course, cancer cells do all the time. After the patients passed away, their brains were examined, and it turns out that a number of neurons in the brain had taken up this dye, and that was prima facie evidence that, in fact, new neurons were being born in the brain. And just to underline, these were elderly people. They were in their 50s and 60s and 70s. So even once you are well past the age of Medicare, your brain is still forming new neurons. And then the question is, under what circumstances does it do so, and can you speed it up? And there the answer turns out to be yes. But surprisingly, you speed it up not by doing crossword puzzles till you're, cross-eyed, but instead through physical activity. Something as simple as an hour of aerobic exercise 5 times a week will dial up the rate of production of new neurons in the brain. So there's, hope for all of us yet.
Brain plasticity is with us from the very beginning. Researcher April Benesich studies infants to gather an understanding of the origins of learning.
When the brain is just sitting quietly, one of the things it's doing is oscillating. And
When you're measuring EEG, which is electroencephalogram, we measure it putting a soft, stretchy sort of shower cap on the baby. You can break the quickness of the oscillation down into various bands, and one of the bands is the gamma band, and that's the highest frequency band. And the interesting thing about gamma is that that's kind of what your brain uses when it's working really hard, because what the gamma oscillations do is they link together further away areas of the brain. When you look at studies of adults and they're doing a difficult task and you're monitoring their brain waves, what you see is when they're doing something very difficult and their brain shifts into gamma and you see this burst of gamma oscillation. So it's kind of like, okay, I'm using everything here. You know, I'm connecting everything up.
Plasticity gives rise to flexible behaviors, but sometimes if we use our plasticity in a certain way, it actually gives rise to rigidities. The way to think about this is that the brain's plasticity is like snow on a hill in winter. It's because the snow is pliable and you can take many different paths down that hill. If you enjoy that path down the hill, you'll tend to favor that path on subsequent runs. Each time you go down that same run, you'll develop a track, and if you keep going down that track, it becomes a rut. Now, this is the way brain plasticity functions, actually. If you keep doing something, our very plastic brains can give rise to a rigid behavior.
Injury, like that experienced in traumatic brain injury patients, is a window into the complex nature of plasticity.
The phone rang around 6:20, and I looked at caller ID, and it said Fort Campbell, and I knew. You know, and so I just said, "John's my son, is he okay?" And he said, "Ma'am, there's been an incident."
Well, I remember running up to a Humvee to start unloading it, and all I remember was falling down, and I thought I smacked my head on my rifle. When I got up, I wiped my forehead, and there was a little bit of blood on it, and I guess the mortar round had exploded about 5 feet away from me. And shrapnel had gone straight through my helmet and then straight through my head.
The affected arm had a greater deficit at shoulder and elbow than the fingers, but even the fingers, he had no dexterity, the thumb was extremely weak, and there was almost nothing that he could do with the arm.
Dr. Taub's therapy reveals several functional aspects of plasticity. His constraint-induced therapy shows that if you put forth concerted effort, you can change even the most dramatic injury.
If you constrain the good arm so that the patient doesn't rely on it, but instead through intensive therapy, which is about 8 hours a day, 5 days a week for a couple of months or more, but just encourage and coax and urge that patient to use the seemingly paralyzed arm, which sounds paradoxical, but they can. They can make tiny little movements, and if they build on those, they can regain function.
The main theme of CI therapy, you either use it or you lose it. And if you've already lost it, that's okay. You can get it back if you keep trying.
When we start thinking about aging and decline, we should be aggressive about our aging. We should be aggressive about life to be able to seize the capacity we have to maintain that capacity. I think the biggest challenge for older adults as they age is to settle. And what I mean by to settle is that they assume that because they're older, they have to settle for less. Less sight, less hearing, less money, less social interaction. The new future of old age should really be based not just on expectations for better, but demanding better. Demanding from yourself, from your family, from companies, and from governments as to how to extend life, not simply to extend age.
There's two factors that contribute here. One is genetics. Our family history is an important component. And the other is our environment. And those relationships between genes and environment dictate the degree of gray matter loss. And so you can influence one and not the other. You can influence your environment, you can stay active, you can exercise your brain just as you can exercise your body. These are enormously helpful in slowing down that degenerative loss that's part of normal aging.
Obviously, as you get older, you both deserve and perhaps are more comfortable with less engagement with certain activities of life. But the disengagement is ultimately, I think, very disadvantageous to the person because they themselves tend to become sedentary, less physical exercise, but it's also a disservice to society. We are in a world in which we are not only challenging the very notions of brain aging, but of aging itself. I think aging is not something that you start when you're 65 or you're 85. It is a lifelong task that we all have to realize that we have a limited time on this planet.
Brain plasticity isn't just for people that have big problems. Brain plasticity is actually for everyone. We have the potential to grow again. To my mind, that's an ideal life.